veteran human rights defender Colette de Clojane. I've known Colette since 2002, I think. In a special way, I would like to express AJJF's gratitude to Open Society Initiative for Southern Africa, which is represented here by Caroline, the Deputy Director. Your support has enabled us conduct this study and other activities to promote human rights and the rule of law in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Please, Caroline, when you return to your office, carry with you a message from AJJF to your colleagues, starting with your director, Stiposami Malunga, and including Nikiwe Kaunda, Zimbabwe Chimbwa, Ayanda Zwane, Levison Kabwata Lona, and others whose names I may not have mentioned here, but with whom we have worked quite closely to get these projects going. Colleagues, before 2020, few, if at all, but most likely none of us, ever imagined that there would be one day, let alone months, when life in the entire world would come to a standstill. But such was the threat that coronavirus posed to the existence of the human race that it required extraordinary measures by governments around the world to counter it. We must admit that in a cultural environment where human rights was respected only in rhetoric, exceptional actions by governments were always bound to have multifaceted effects, even on human rights. The objective of this study and its limitations, with international travel banned and lockdowns in virtually all the countries under study, the study relied on desk research and some limited interviews were made. On the law, it must be stated from the outset that human rights law at domestic, regional, and international level allows reasonable limitation of some human rights when faced with a natural disaster such as the COVID-19 pandemic. However, such limitations of rights must be consistent with the principles of proportionality and non-discrimination. Further, some rights are non-derogable and must be respected even during the subsistence of a national disaster or a public emergency, such as the coronavirus presented Southern Africa with. The study arrives at some key findings, which I'm going to discuss below. What I'm doing here is simply sharing a sneak peek of the contents of the report. Otherwise, for the details of the report, one would have to look at the report itself, which Justice Chinengo is going to launch this morning, and will be immediately available on this chart and on our website. Finding number one, emergency measures have resulted in the limitation of non-derogable rights, including the right to life and to freedom from torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, and the right to human dignity. On the right to life, on 26 September 2020, in a case of reckless and unwarranted brutality, police shot and killed a 17-year-old boy while purporting to enforce COVID-19 regulations in a Lusaka nightclub. In Zimbabwe, the Zimbabwe Human Rights NGO Forum documented 4 cases of extrajudicial killings during the first 180 days of the COVID-19 lockdown, just in 180 days alone. On freedom from torture and other cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment and punishment, Botswana had 3 prominent cases, including one where a 22-year-old girl moving with her 18-year-old brother were assaulted by police somewhere in
it's 12 hours
near Lubate while enforcing COVID-19 lockdown regulations. The president issued a press release and promised to investigate the case, but nothing has come out of those promises yet. There was also the ordeal of the opposition politician Nicholas Huputso of the Umbrella for Democratic Change, who was allegedly harassed by 12 police officers for allegedly causing noise during the COVID-19 lockdown. And then there was the stripping naked and depriving Oratile Dikuluhang of oxygen during police interrogation. He had been accused and charged over Facebook posts around COVID-19 and the local politics of Botswana. In Zambia, the Human Rights Commission, at the time of this research, and this research was conducted last year, reported that they had received and were investigating more than 10 cases of alleged torture, mainly at the hands of Zambian police service, and that some of these cases had, were constituting aggravated torture and resulted in the death of the victims. In Zimbabwe, 3 leaders of the opposition MDC Alliance Party were on 13th of May 2020 subjected to enforced disappearances, were sexually harassed, sexually assaulted and abandoned somewhere in Bindura. Unknown assailants abducted Tawanda Mchehiwa in Bulawayo. He sustained serious injuries, with the doctors who attended to him saying he was exhibiting symptoms of acute renal failure. The judgment in Lucia Mashondo and Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights Against Home Affairs and Cultural Heritage and others, prohibiting police from using unwarranted and disproportionate force against citizens in Zimbabwe in the enforcement of national lockdown, did little, if nothing, to stop the police. The other finding is that some restrictive measures do not actually meet the requirements of reasonableness, necessity, and proportionality. These include, but are not limited to, the demolition of vending market stalls in Zimbabwe, for instance, which is a big problem, and the criminalizing of public critique of government responses to the pandemic. On 9th April in Zimbabwe, in Zambia, the broadcasting regulator cancelled Prime TV's license. It is noted that the independent broadcaster has been, Prime TV has been a critic of the government and had refused to flight government's COVID-19 adverts for free. Laws were passed to criminalize the generation and exchange of corona-related information which was not sourced from the government in a number of countries, and several people were prosecuted under these provisions. Look at Botswana alone, where police arrested a school teacher called Raki Kilesamile for personal observations that he had made on his Facebook page, and that he had questioned a claim by government that a social worker who had screened lawmakers during a heated parliamentary debate on the emergency had tested positive for the coronavirus. He also questioned why people infected with COVID-19 in hospital were not receiving or were not recovering or developing further complications. And he was arrested and charged for misinformation under Article 30 of the Emergency Powers Act. In another incident, again, police detained Justice Matlavane, is Justice, not the judge, but a name, and Oratile Dikuluhang. It must be noted that these are actually allied to the opposition, to the party of the former President Ian Khama. So they were detained for posting so it was claimed, for posting information that intended to deceive readers or any person of the real intentions and measures taken by the government to address COVID-19. Their postings were later disabled by police after the police withdrew the passwords from the three accused people. The Zambia Information and Communications Technology Authority generated and distributed mass texts threatening to prosecute any persons who disseminated false information related to COVID-19. The third key finding is that unreasonable restrictive measures have been deleterious to the right of access to livelihoods across the region, and the report discusses those instances. The fourth, several rights and fundamental freedoms have been curtailed as part of the response to the pandemic, and these include but are not limited to the right to social security, adequate healthcare, adequate housing, access to water, dignity, and equality. I think in Zimbabwe there were cases around some of these issues. There was litigation around water and issues around socioeconomic rights. The COVID-19 pandemic has been used as a cover to deprive people of political representation, restrict civic space, and strengthen authoritarianism. For example, in Zambia, as Caroline just mentioned and repeated by Arnold, in Zambia, the ruling party, the Patriotic Front, has continued to hold uninterrupted public meetings, and security agents, together with the PF supporters, have reportedly stopped or interrupted any opposition party meetings under the guise of enforcing COVID regulations. For long, the government had used the Draconian Public Order Act to curtail opposition parties' activities. But now the COVID-19 situation is actually working even better for them than the Public Order Act. Finally, the study makes some recommendations, some of which Caroline has mentioned quite forcefully, as though she had been part of this study already. One is that states should prepare to invest adequate efforts in securing vaccines to inoculate the populations of the region. Vaccines should be administered promptly and free of charge to all populations, including rural areas, without discrimination. And that's where Caroline's idea of leaving no one behind comes. AJJF recommends that practical legal measures be taken to ensure that the victims of these violations obtain appropriate relief, which restores the rights and deters against future violations. And this should include, but not limited to, damages and personal costs against the perpetrators. Law enforcement and security forces must be provided with adequate human rights education to sensitize them about their duty to observe non-derogable rights at all times, including and during states of public emergency. Well, we talk about law enforcement and security agencies being provided with adequate human rights training. I think that is good. It treats the symptom. It doesn't treat the problem. The problem is the culture, because if the culture is permissive, if the executive pass on by their conduct information that harassing people, especially if the opposition is proper and will go without without check, then law enforcement agencies will always do it because they'll be doing it on behalf of the executive. The fourth recommendation we make is that authorities should regularly review the restrictions and discontinue those which are not strictly necessary to combat the spread of COVID-19. Compensation, again, must be considered in line with regional and international law for the victims of human rights violations arising from the implementation of unnecessary restrictive measures. We also recommend that authorities establish specialized oversight mechanisms dedicated to monitoring and implementation of restrictive measures to ensure compliance with the domestic, regional, and international law. AJJF also recommends measures to be undertaken to enforce more. I will leave that. Some governments use the pandemic as a cover to strengthen the authoritarianism and deprive people of their right to political representation. We recommend that states must respect and protect the right to political participation and representation. In particular, AJJF calls upon states to ensure that the right to regular, free, and fair elections be respected during the pandemic in line with domestic, regional, and international law. As a lesson learned from the ongoing vaccine hoarding by the rich nations, which has been variously referred to as vaccine nationalism or vaccine appetite, the region should take a long-term view to the promotion of the health of its people and their protection during times of a public emergency. Governments must therefore take deliberate steps to reduce overdependence on international pharmaceutical supply chains by investing in scientific innovation back home. There are some governments that are doing this, I'm aware, but I think the efforts are still limited. I know that Kenya has invested through KEMRI in the local development of vaccines and cures. In Uganda now they have developed, there are 3 vaccine candidates that are being conducted, that are being considered, and their therapeutics also being considered. But again, because Africa is not known for innovation, we lack confidence in ourselves. We always believe we need approval. So I see that one of the vaccines being researched upon in Uganda has by itself invited the American National Federal Drug Agency to work with it, just because they want to have this affirmation by the international community that indeed this is a genuine innovation. That is okay for now, because it's good to start. It's good to start these innovations, but we must continue with them. When there was some time during the first wave, the African Development Bank recorded 182 innovations that had been made by Africans around coronavirus. But I think many of them could actually have been abandoned, partly because we just don't have the confidence in ourselves that we can make it, or that when we produce, what we produce can be and will be respected internationally. There is another or two, actually, 2 areas which Caroline mentioned, which we discussed, but I think finally did not find their way into the recommendations here. I don't see them here. But we had recommended that that African governments be encouraged and engaged to invest more in the development of health infrastructure and systems, and also around discussions on developing inclusive social safety systems. So that is, those are some of the recommendations that we make. We are interested and willing to take some of these forward in different fora through advocacy and other means. So finally, I would like to thank all my colleagues.